Well, good afternoon, everyone. And like I mentioned, we've got a fantastic discussion lined up for today. And, I think it's a very relevant topic. We've seen a lot of coverage this year in the sort of new COVID environment that we've all living in and working through. And, I'd like to welcome and introduce today's panel. So we have Stephen Horn, the director from Red Hat Cyber and Data Security. We have Stuart Fern, the CTO by 9x5 Consulting. And we also have Paul Pearman, who's the business development manager from Red Hat Cyber and Data Security. I'm really looking forward to getting some insights today, from our panel and understanding, what small, medium enterprise businesses can do to combat, what we're seeing out there in the marketplace. So, let's just jump straight into it. I think the first question really is, this year has been a very disruptive year, and we've seen businesses struggle to adapt in this sort of rapid changing environment. Steve and Stuart, what are some of the insights you've seen from where we were, and where we are at the end of 2020 regarding security and company data?
Well, I can start with that, I guess. We're at the end of 2020 here, and we probably still don't know who the elected leader of America is. I think that's kind of a poignant point as well, because if you think about it, a lot of this could be avoided with IT-based voting systems. But I guess you got to ask the question is why? We're in 2020, we don't have this. I think it's cybersecurity, obviously. It just shows you how afraid some of these governments are of just cyber and the topic of cyber. But you've also got to think, we're in 2020 here. Is everyone afraid of this cyber stuff, and are people operating? Yes, they are. Yeah, because obviously you've still got Google, Facebook, Amazon, all your big players there. And it just shows you that the leader of cyber these days, it's not the governments, it's not some of these organizations, it's basically businesses. And it's businesses that have to be obviously rapidly developing, obviously some of these security procedures, some of the software, and just the way you operate in cyber as well in 2020. So we've got to start to be the leaders in 2020 in cyber, and obviously to give direction to these people, and even to government, because obviously they're slow to adapt to these kind of things. And it just shows you, even in 2020, like SpaceX now, they're like the leader of satellite delivery, whereas, NASA contracts to them, a government organization like that. So obviously there's IT providers that are experts in these kind of fields, and you've really got to kind of go look for them. So I guess 2020, is really about cyber, and it just shows you where we kind of position in it as well, and there's and where we've got to be obviously looking to the future.
And possibly, Steve, sort of understanding, I think, like you're saying, 2020 sort of made us all aware of the vulnerabilities that we've seen. What are some of those types of threats or common threats? And I know we'll expand on this in a bit more detail, but sort of just to set the scene for everyone.
Yeah, okay. Oh, well, obviously, that coronavirus has kind of like forced people to get creative when it comes to communicating with obviously your colleagues and all your customers. And I guess it's also pushed a lot of unprepared businesses into using these kind of video conferencing or / new technologies or new platforms or new cloud platforms. So I guess it's opened up a lot of exploits using exactly those things as well, from Zoom to even to your Office 365. I guess a big one that's even come through my table a fair bit is even like your Office 365 tenant, who owns it, administration of it, access to it, a big one, because it's such a powerful tool. And I would say that 95% of businesses out there in Australia as well are using Office 365, and it's kind of what kind of things can you throw over Office 365 to protect it, and obviously to have audits against that as well. That's quite a big one, I find, as well. So video conferencing is kind of big one, and obviously you've got pathways that lead into accessing all these new kind of technologies as well for these businesses. It's obviously bring your own devices. Now they've got new devices in new locations connecting back to all these kind of new services. And obviously anything that's fresh is going to be keen target for anything in cyber for 2020 we've seen.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Stuart, and from your side, 9by5 really sort of leads the way in that consultancy space and with advice services, and has that hands-on experience. From your side, what are your observations that you've seen this year?
So as the only American on this call, I think I'd have to first and foremost say that the election is over. And we do have hopefully we'll have a smooth transition of power. But yes, I believe cyber is definitely something that scares the U.S. in elections. But there's also something really nostalgic about going to cast your vote in a paper sense. So even if cyber becomes the safest that you can make it, I don't know if U.S. elections will ever move to a fully online digital platform. I mean, I remember as a kid going and standing in a little modem booth with my parents as they flicked the little levers. So I think that there's something that you'll never get away from in the States with that type of election system. So I divulge for a second just to bring us back to my childhood. But I think Steve was right on the horn of what we're seeing most often, which is I remember at the beginning of March walking through this city and seeing people just carrying out monitors and keyboards and mice and docking stations out of their offices into the unknown of what became March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and now into December. So on top of all of what he said, I think there's also something that we think about, which is asset liability and asset tracking. How much of this is ever going to come back to the office? How many employees were let go or furloughed during that time period that there's a write-off of all these assets that are never going to come back. Monitors and keyboards, yeah, you know what? There's nothing on them. Who cares? But the laptop, the iPad, the mobile device that has email, that has file share, that has storage, that's the stuff that you really need to start thinking about, which is, what was on those devices? Were they encrypted? Can you remote control them? Can you remote wipe them? Are you going to have the ability to control your corporate identity and your corporate information, regardless of how and where it was taken?
Awesome. And I think that's probably it's a really nice segue into sort of our next topic is seeing the vulnerabilities and seeing those devices as a window into your office environment and into your sort of your secure area of your business, where much like Stuart, you've said, a lot of it was overlooked because things were happening so rapidly. Stuart, what has working remotely meant this year for a company's security posture?
I think your question there was obviously about working remotely and the security posture of the endpoint. I guess when that question comes onto my table as well, it comes on and says, okay, how do we protect all of a bring your own devices? And they pretty much come back with saying, okay, we're with Microsoft, we're with Google G Suite. They always kind of lead in the conversation this way, and they always kind of hide behind the vendor's name and not the specifics of how they secure, and obviously the specifics of the endpoint as well. So when people say that no, everything's secure, we run with Microsoft 365 or G Suite, they've really kind of look past that and say, okay, that's obviously your platform, but how are people getting there? And the endpoints are often overlooked or kind of undercooked, we find as well, just trying to access these platforms. And especially now in 2020, everyone's really pushing on those kind of platforms to kind of get all their work done and obviously connect all their colleagues together.
And I think a question that you even have to ask there is really, those devices have now sort of left your environment. They've been unsecured and in use at home for a period of time. Yeah. How do you claw back that security, and what do you do, to secure it from there?
Yes. Yeah. Well, a lot of these steps to obviously to secure a lot of these infrastructure. There's obviously a lot of consultation with different vendors. Because you've really got to get into specifics with a lot of cybersecurity, and not just general statements and not just general providers saying, yeah, everything's secure, everything's green lighted. We've got one package to do everything. It's not the case. Yeah.
Yes, Steve made a great point around people are accessing it. you have to be able to access the information. Your workers still had to be productive during this time. So if you just, put a big firewall up in front of everything, you people are just going to sit there and twiddle their thumbs all day, right? Your goal of a business is still to produce something, to create value for your customers, and to promote the value add service that you're providing. So if you could not have the straight lockdown networks. So the ability to secure the access points and how they're getting to it, but still give speed and reliability and the information needed, it was key. If you think about Gartner's studies over the last, couple of years, there was something like 50 or 60% of time of knowledge workers' time was spent looking for information and trying to gather that, out of databases or file servers or shares or teams or wikis or dockies or you name it. I think that if Gartner goes back and does that survey again this year, that number is probably going to be closer to 70 or 80%, because now people are even using more disparate file storage services. If the file was too big for your corporate directory, or it was too big for email, I've heard about people just dropping it into, your iCloud folder and sharing it. And that goes back to that, where are these things stored in the long term, and who has the rights and owns them?
Yeah, I think you're definitely right there, Stuart. And I think it's an important one too, that a lot of these businesses can benefit from outsourcing a lot of some of this IT infrastructure management as well, because you can streamline a lot of these processes as well, because you've got so many options now from obviously all the, as you kind of listed out there as well. You just kind of really need to leverage on your kind of expertise of IT specialists that come up with some kind of cost-effective solution for accessing this stuff and obviously doing it securely.
I think it's great, and it's it's sort of interesting to get that insight and understand what everyone's been seeing, and possibly, Paul, if I can sort of jump to you and ask us to talk us through what we've seen in our connected world. Data is getting created from more places than ever before, and highlighting the threats, in turn creating more vulnerability points where people interact with companies' data, be it a staff intranet, a customer portal. Just some of the examples there from Stuart and Steve. Was a file shared using someone's private iCloud versus a company tool? Paul, just talk us through what we've seen, and the impact that some businesses have felt.
Look, I think the figure alone in April 2020 was a rise in BYOD here in Australia of over 40%. So, and that may even be more. But look, thanks, Dylan. What I'd like to talk about really is what we've seen. So large businesses alone are not the only targets of threat actors. It's reported that the increase and continuation of remote and flexible working, both here and abroad, in particular abroad, but still here, small and medium businesses will be targeted with sophisticated attack vectors. Look, since the launch of Report Cyber by the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, or the ACSC, which I'll refer to, on the 1st of July 2019, there have been 59,806 cybercrime reports. And that's what you can see on the screen there. That's an average of 164 per day, or one report. Now, I will say reported cybercrime every 10 minutes. So over the last 3 months there of that report, April, May and June, there was a 5% increase in numbers, reaching over 170 cybercrimes per day. Now, during the entire period, the ACSC saw two notable spikes, one in October and the next one in April that you can see there. The spike in October was associated with a widespread Emotet malware campaign. We're still talking about that thing 4 or 5 years later, with the malicious Trojan doing the rounds among Australian inboxes at the time. You can see another rise in reported cybercrime in April, which was related to a particular bulk extortion campaign. Look, throughout the pandemic, there's been an increase in reported spear phishing campaigns and an increase of COVID-19 themed malicious cyber activity. These are reported cybercrimes, so you've got to think about what the number actually is, and you've got to take into account the cybercrimes that aren't reported.
And I think, that's an interesting one there. I don't recall another year in the past where we've had the Prime Minister stand up to address the nation to say that cyber is now something everyone needs to be thinking about. So, it's definitely a topic that's on the minds of everyone, and if it's not, it definitely should be.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember that day, and it's definitely in the zeitgeist in Australia right now. So,
Paul, and take us, forward from there, and just talk us through some of, the other sort of observations and some of the examples of what we've seen.
yeah, look, moving into 2020, there was a dramatic increase in evasive malware, whereas in 2019 it made up for 35% of all evasive malware, but it was 68% leading into this year alone. There was still the Microsoft Excel exploit was being heavily used, a vulnerability from 2017. So we're continually seeing these vulnerabilities prop its head up on that rotating wheel. It's delivered via a phishing attack and exploits macros to download and install other types of malware, including keyloggers, so lightweight keyloggers like Agent Tesla and Trojans like Razzie. The analysis of the Agent Tesla keylogger used in phishing attacks in February 2020, that was aimed to manipulate fears around the coronavirus. Not that we needed any more fears around that. Agent Tesla is one of several pieces of malware that's delivered by the Microsoft Excel malware that I referred to. Mac adware jumps in popularity as well. So one of the top compromised websites hosts Mac OS adware called a Bundler that masquerades as an Adobe Flash update. This lines up with a report from February 2020 that showed a rise in Mac malware, particularly adware. SQL injection attacks became the top network attack in 2019, which increased by a massive 8,000% from 18 to 19, and becoming the most common network attack of the year by a significant margin. And look, hackers increasingly are using automated malware distribution. Many attacks hit 70 to 80% of all fireboxes in a single country, suggesting that attackers are automating their attacks more frequently.
And it'll be interesting to see, when we close out this year and we start to see all the reports, update over the COVID period, to see the findings and see what trends are really established. But, some really interesting stats there.
Yeah, just moving into the threat types and back onto the report from the ACSC. So if we can go to the next slide there. As you can see here, this is back from the July 1, 2019 through to the June 30, 2020 period, as reported by the ACSC. The most common category of cybercrime, we're talking about cybercrime, reported is fraud at 39.86% or just short of 24,000, which relates to criminals obtaining benefit through deception or investment or shopping scams. However, identity-related crimes incorporating the theft and misuse of personal information, which is what we're so fearful of, was the second most common category at just short of 20,000. The key point to note here again is that these cases are the ones that have been reported. So what if we knew exactly how many cases were not reported? And you've got to think about how high that number would go. Would it be one every 10 minutes or one every 2 minutes? We don't know. So because of this unknown, it really is the company's ethical responsibility to protect against not just the attacks that are in the zeitgeist that you see on the news, and it's against all types of attacks, including lightweight attacks, whether you're a small, medium or large business. It's your ethical responsibility.
And I think, what's evident to me is that we all need to be aware. You've got to be aware of how you interact when you online or you're working from home, and what are you doing with your devices. And it's it's definitely something that we should all be thinking about. Paul, if we look now, it's those sort of examples that you shared with me before, of where things have gone wrong for sort of small, medium and enterprise customers. Talk us through what we've seen in these examples.
Yeah, look, just recently reported, in fact, this month, Sydney hedge fund Levitas Capital have closed down after a September cyber attack, which caused one of its biggest clients to withdraw its money. So after a sketchy Zoom invitation, we all know how much time we've spent on Zoom this year alone. One of the hedge fund managers had his system infected by malware, and that ceded control of his emails. Subsequently, over $8.7 million worth of invoices were sent from the fund manager's email account. And in 2 months, that Australian company unfortunately has gone from managing $75 million worth of hedge funds to being closed down. If we just move on and look at another a large case study, if we can just scoot through to the next slide there. Landmark White, the Australian property valuation firm, in 2019, early 2019, suffered not one but two different breaches that ultimately brought the company to its knees. So how did this happen? Firstly, the means of compromise was not due to a sophisticated attack, and that's what we're seeing more. Rather, it was attributed to a basic failure to enforce authentication requirements for API connections to the valuation firm, and that the actual portal that was compromised. It was used by internal staff for valuation, so it may not really seem as a target, but in this case it was. And it was reported shortly after that the home loan details of up to 100,000 initially customers were hacked in the data breach, and that included property valuations, personal contact information of homeowners, residents and property agents, first, last name, addresses and contact phone numbers, just the kind of thing that you don't want anyone to know when you're looking at a valuation. Look, the breach led to major banks suspending Landmark White immediately from their value of panels. So it not only affected the company, it affected the suppliers and the customers of those suppliers as well. So it really sent the Landmark White into overdrive, contacting customers, and also the major banks contacting their customers. So there was a severe loss of the bank's integrity and Landmark White's integrity, in addition to the loss of confidentiality of the customer's sensitive information. To move forward, 1 week later, Landmark White shares were suspended, and it was revealed on the dark web where over 137,500 unique valuation records appeared, including 1,680 supporting documents. And 1 month after the breach, high-level senior positions were left vacant. Reports in May of 2019 indicated that the breach had cost up to $7 million. And then when shares did return 3 months after the breach, they experienced a 31% drop, of which they've not recovered to date, as you can see on the screen there. In addition, suffering another internal breach, they just couldn't. They were quite unlucky with this another breach, an internal IT contractor, which by the end of the year saw Landmark White rebranded as Acumentis, as the brand had lost a great deal of integrity with their base. And up to 1.5 years later, it's revealed that it's actually wiped over $50 million from that brand. And one needs to think about the cost remediation and the cost to mitigate against that vulnerability in the first place. It wouldn't be as much as what they've experienced, obviously. To bring it back home, though, it's not just hedge funds or valuation property firms that are targets. If we look at this example in June 2019, Nagle Catholic College, located in a lovely part of the world, Geraldton, Western Australia, they had to make a series of embarrassing phone calls to parents, warning them that their bank account details and their signatures may have been compromised after the school was attacked over 4 days. So essentially, a phishing email was opened by the college, which released an executive file on the school system and which observed the correspondence in what's known as a man-in-the-middle attack. So any parent correspondent relating to sensitive data may have been taken. Now, for a school, that's not a call that you want to make, and for a parent, that's not a call that you want to take. I can speak being a parent myself. So
it's definitely a scary thought, and I think just if you look at those three examples right there, attacks have been a part of our sort of IT space for a long time, but they're definitely becoming more prevalent now. Particularly now working from home in 2020 and moving ahead, where there'll be a lot more flexibility about working arrangements. So yeah, it's hugely interesting, Paul, to see how it affects everyone in that space. It's particularly the schools.
Absolutely, I agree with that. If I could just look at the incidents by sector as well, just to break it down further, and this was reported by the ACSC. A large proportion of incidents are reported by Commonwealth, state and territory governments, which is due to their close working relationship with obviously the ACSC and their willingness to report incidents. So Australia's critical infrastructure sectors, including electricity, water, health, communications, and education, represented around 35% of all the incidents that were reported. But most sectors have been targets as per what you can see on the screen there, and this is for the 1 July to 30 June period. Subsequently, though, it's not just large business that's under threat. So as attack vectors get smarter and more agile, security posture of businesses are less secure. So with relation to the transforming workplace and the continuation of that transforming workplace here in Australia, so small and medium businesses are definitely targets moving into 2021.
And I think that's something that is quite clear, is that, it's something that everyone needs to be thinking about, and, taking those steps to sort of plug the holes and, sort of adopt those strategies that Steve and Stuart have sort of mentioned.
I might just step in there, and with these kind of attacks as well, when they succeed as well, they succeed silently. That's the perfect success. So you're not going to see anything on these reports. You kind of, as Paul says, the whole goal of it is for these attackers to be silent and obviously and to have no attribution towards these attackers. And obviously now there is actually, I think in 2020, there's a big push now for more attribution. There's a lot of these attacks, and there's obviously, you're notifying government agencies now, and especially in Australia, it's a big thing, especially with the cyber, obviously the cyber websites they've got from the government as well, to easily kind of register these attacks and all these kind of exploits as well.
And this sort of leads us nicely into the next slide and our sort of next part of our discussion. But, Stuart and Steve, and maybe starting with you, Stuart, what are the first steps that, we look at securing a company's digital infrastructure? We know that there's a problem. We understand that it's when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. Where do we need to start, and how do we combat this?
Science. This is the same thing that us as IT professionals have been saying and implementing and planning and executing for years, right? So it starts with vet your applications, know what you're using and where you're using it, who's using it and how they're using it. So what applications, how they're running, what users are running them, and go from there. The second one, which I don't know how many times we've said this, which is the interval.
And, sorry, go ahead.
Again, it almost goes back to facts management. We heard Paul say earlier that the vulnerability that was exploited earlier was from a 2007 known incident that has already been patched. That's a 3-year-old computer that hasn't been patched in that long. There's a bigger issue in that case itself. And one that I think that the second to last one I'm going to call out is multi-factor. If we can implement multi-factor authentication, it alleviates so many of these other issues, because those phishing attacks, those man in the middles, those the issue that we heard about with the fund management and transferring funds, a lot of that would be mitigated by putting a second set of authentication that is a known source of ID.
And I think that's possibly one of the things what seems like something that should be obvious, and something that a business should adopt, is obviously it's difficult. And touching back to what Steve said right at the beginning, I think it's important to sort of reach out and have those discussions with the specialists. Steve, just talk us through around some of those points around privacy, and expanding on what Stuart's just started us off on.
Well, obviously, to have a look at obviously the digital infrastructure and how you can look at compliance for obviously looking to 2021. I guess it takes a lot of planning, and as Stuart said, you've got to have your game plan already kind of laid out as well. You've got to have a kind of a bit of a base there as well. Obviously have your standard stuff done, all your backups. IT security policies, have something written down. And I think a big one out of that as well, a lot of people do have that and they think it's a formal documentation thing. They've got a Word document somewhere here, they've printed it out, they've put it out there. But you've really got to put it into play as well. And you've kind of role played a little bit as well. You've got to have a conference with some of your, obviously, some of your leading kind of providers from either you might have an outsourced kind of provider of some of your portals or some of your web or some kind of these forms you might fill out on online as well. You probably want to have a bit of a data breach exercise saying, what is your first response to us? If our data goes, if it's seen somewhere, or if there's some kind of incident, who do you report to? What kind of things? How do you assess it? And kind of get that streamlined. Because I think if there is an incident, it's how fast you react and how well you react to these incidents. And I think you've got to have your game plan polished as well. You know what I mean? There's no point having these documents kind of somewhere in the thing and saying, we've done it, it's done. You've really got to polish it. You've got to introduce a lot of your providers into these policies as well, so they're aware of it as well. That's probably number one. I think go through, have a look, get your game plan, obviously know how to play it. And obviously go through your backups, just all the standard stuff as well. But you've really got to look a little bit further as well. Get other IT providers involved. Have a different avenue of looking at your network from different angles. From someone else's eyes can be a benefit to you. Obviously, with streamlining processes as well as making things more secure.
And Stuart, the next slide is a slide that I really connect with, and understanding 9x5 and the advice and the consultancy work that you do, particularly in this space. Just talk us through some of these hygiene, these points that a company should be thinking about.
It goes back to plan and execute, and know where you need to bring in the expertise where you can't perform this yourself. Anti-malware, not anti-firewall, and malware and real firewall. Know the difference between hardware and software firewalls. Know where you want to use those issues. It goes back to earlier what I said, right? Secure your devices. You can't really secure a monitor, but you can secure everything else that that has an IP address, a phone, a computer, an iPad, and everything else that they're using. Require VPN usage. It's an interesting one to think about, right? And know that if you're going to do that, that you have the bandwidth to support that you're actually able to promote that. One thing that I think Steve or Paul said earlier is that when you have these devices in your home, and then eventually as some of us start coming back to the office, what is there a policy to scan devices when they come in, right? We all need to get our temperature checked now. Is there a digital check of your computer? And how many people have worked at home with a partner, with a flatmate, with their kids working from home? And do you know what your kids are doing in their back bedroom when they're torrenting on the internet, or they're downloading illegal movies? And I'm sure that you don't have your computer segregated on its own Wi-Fi network or its own VLAN or something else. So is that affecting what you're going to bring back to your office? So I would think use this as a broader checklist guide to the previous slide that we talked about.
I think that's you made some really thought-provoking points there. And definitely we're all doing the temperature checking. Those of us that are fortunate enough to be going back into the office a few days a week. We need to start thinking about the rest of the business and like you mentioned, the devices. If we sort of move on to the next slide and just some of those questions that I know we hear, Steve or Paul, one of them is around, for a lot of businesses, cost is always a challenge, and how can large hardware expenses be averted? Just touch on that for me, Paul and Steve, and just give us your thoughts around alternative methods to avoid those hardware expenses.
I guess bring your own devices is a big one. A lot of businesses now, they use bring your own devices without them even knowing the term bring your own devices. They've extended their reach onto to home networks, as Stuart was saying. and even into home computers and home printers and even all these kind of devices. Because it wasn't okay. Let's plan this COVID thing. It really did hit quickly, and and it's not just let's shut down the business before we kind of can get our strategy ready and get all our workers working at home correctly. No, it was just work at home. We're starting to work at home next week. You know what I mean? That's how a lot of the businesses have seen this. But there was some consultation with some of the bigger businesses that we deal with, but obviously we had to go back and consult and obviously to identify to some of these other older businesses as well that didn't come and see us as well. So I think it's an important one. So I guess to be able to, what I'm trying to say to how do you kind of to avoid some of these large hardware expenses is to use some of bring your own devices, but to have a methodology and have a secure way of using them as well. And there's obviously ways with different types of software, Century Bay Client, obviously, and different other types of software, and obviously policies you can monitor these things as well.
I was just going to back up what Steve said. I've got the picture. I think Stu mentioned it earlier that people were, flocking out of the CBD with their hardware with them and in droves back in March. And I think you couldn't see the forest through the trees then, but there is time on your side. You can just take a step back and use common sense. There are other providers out there other than having to just have a whole expense on large hardware to mitigate against these vulnerabilities. Whether we like it or not, flexibility and remote working and BYOD is here to stay, and there are other avenues that you can secure that BYOD moving forward.
No, I think that's great. And I know one of the other areas that also sort of frightens people is when we talk about legacy, and legacy applications. Steve, what should your strategy be? And adding to that, even APIs.
Yes.
Those are some of those areas that frighten people.
Big time. I think a lot of IT service providers, that's the kind of the bugbear for them is any of these legacy applications. Those applications you really kind of, the business requires to use. They might have some kind of slow kind of development or stop development, of the software, and it still needs to be run. I think this is the big one, and I think this is where a lot of these IT guys lose sleep at night as well, because they've always got that one in the back of their mind. They know that if they're going to get that 3 a.m. phone call, it's going to be about this legacy application. The bugbear is going to get them, And so, but there is solutions for this. It's involved kind of wrapping these legacy applications up with different layers and different ways to access it. So you can still use them, and to obviously to authenticate that endpoint to make sure that that endpoint is secure and using that legacy application only, and that tunnel to get there is completely secure as well.
Awesome. And if we just make this sort of a bit of a roundtable discussion, just feel free to jump in, guys. Something that we hear often is around is antivirus and endpoint detection and response enough? What are your thoughts on that, Stuart, if you want to start us off?
A couple of us in the 9x5 team were actually at a reasonably sized small to medium business today this morning, and they were talking about how they were still using access to control 2 key systems. And I think that hits 2 parts, which is the legacy applications, which is how many access databases are still out there, but then even staff upskilling, right? He admitted to us that this access application was written by someone who's no longer at the organization, and it's just a keep the lights on kind of a skill set that they had there. So how do you think about who the people are that are actually running this, and making sure that you have the most knowledgeable systems or people to run the systems, and then moreover, is there a migration plan to mitigate that risk from these legacy applications to a long-term, even moving them into a more cloud-based system where you have a tighter control, or put them within a VPN tunnel where you have less vulnerability and you take out some of the risk mitigation to them.
Stuart, too, just extending from that point as well, I think with a lot of these applications, as you're saying with Access as well, there's a lot of like stale and slow kind of developers as well, and it kind of once you've got access to one of these kind of slow developers as well, and like updates are difficult, hard to get contact as well, it kind of highlights, okay, this is going to be a legacy application pretty quickly. You know what I mean? And you can kind of see that at the start. And I think obviously looking timeline of when you should upgrade, when you should look at these things, it's probably sometimes you've got to look at obviously some of the developers of this stuff and go, okay, yeah, I think it's time to change as well. Because if you really want a secure modern infrastructure, you really need to have someone that's fast acting and obviously using the latest technology.
Right into the APIs and customer portals. How can you secure them? I think that we're seeing is so much more business being done remotely, as obviously, but so many more businesses uploading invoices instead of sending them by snail mail or requesting payments that way. That this is either via by API, by digital to digital, from banking to bank system, or if you think about transportation and healthcare, in the EDI space, moving into more of that automation process. You have to think about the vulnerabilities there. So who can access it, how they're accessing it. Are you setting hard password requirements? Are you making a customer check their email once a quarter, or every twice a year at least, make sure that they're still there? How do you make sure that if someone left, how do you control them to get out of that? So it's having a relationship with the customers also. And we're not talking about B2C here. I'm talking about a lot of it just straight B2B, where you actually know who your suppliers are, who your customers are, and there's a much more direct relationship. So I think the concept of even having customer relationship managers, or even people really working through some of this, is not just a technology play, but this is also a relationship management. And this is a time where you can build deeper relationships and trust with your clients and your vendors that we may not see the opportunity to do this in the long term again.
I think that's all. It's so interesting, and I'm enjoying sort of talking through it all today. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people thinking through what we've said, and taking that moment. I think you said, Steve, just to take a breath and look at how you run everything internally, and make some decisions to better position their sort of cyber and IT security. If we move into the next slide, and just sort of where to from here, and looking at, I think some of the things that have come across quite clearly to me is obviously this awareness. In those examples, Paul, that you took us through, it's not always obvious how the attack might happen or where it's coming from. And Steve, your point that you made around, a successful attack is a silent attack, and Stuart, some of those points in your Essential 8 that you took us through around, really spending the time and thinking through what you need to put in place to get ahead, and know that you secure, before it even happens. What are some of your final thoughts around moving into the new year and 2021? Stuart, do you want to talk us through where you think we're heading, and where people should be looking right now?
I'll hit the first part, which is go back and define what your plan is for the future. Are you going to have a mixed work from home, work from business, work from the coffee shop, workforce? What tools are they asking for now? Do they have access to access to the information? So build them what they need to succeed. Otherwise, if they don't have it, they're going to leave your organization, and your organization is not going to be able to succeed, and someone else is going to build a better toolbox, a better mousetrap, and do the job better than yourself. I think Steven said it, earlier, right? Maintain this, right? So know that whatever you're going to build has to going to have ongoing maintenance, there's going to be vulnerabilities. There's going to be shortcomings in what you build. So have a maintenance plan, have a thought process, and lastly, grow. Take that little bit of challenge. Know what you can do, and find either a partner or find a resource internally that can take organization to the next level. There's no opportunity without risk. So, define the risk, know the risk, and then iterate through into the future.
Yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. Just on the ending, kind of just to wrap it up, really last words is it's really straightforward. Kind of there is fragility in your IT systems. You've got to understand them. You know what I mean? Everyone's got fragility in some of these systems, but all we're saying is hey, there's a better way to do business, and we can help you.
I think that's great, and just thank you to everyone for a great session today. Certainly my main takeaway is that cyber and security is important, and it's not too late. And I think definitely what comes across clearly is talk to your partners, develop a solution to fit your business, regardless if you're a small business or a large enterprise working remotely. It's something that we all really need to be aware of. And and thank you to our audience for tuning in and joining us on this journey. And gentlemen, thank you all for your time. And just to everyone out there, if you are looking for advice, definitely please reach out to Stuart, Steve, and Paul. And it's been great to spend this afternoon with you. Thank you.